And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a senior US intelligence official says Russian missiles have crossed into NATO member Poland, killing 2 people. A wave of airstrikes against Ukraine include an attack on the capital, Kyiv. Pentagon Press Secretary Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder says they're still investigating the facts.
We're looking into these reports, don't have any information to corroborate them at this time, so I don't want to speculate or get into hypotheticals.
Our Washington correspondent Simon Marks says it's a big issue for the US and other members of NATO.
President Biden has consistently drawn a line in the sand and said there will be no direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia for so long as the military conflict is contained within Ukrainian territory, but that the moment any NATO member came under attack, that is construed as an attack on every member of NATO.
Analysis by LBC has revealed more than 1 million people in England, more than 1 in 8 households, are living in unsafe social homes. It says a coroner says the death of 2-year-old Awab Ishaq from damp must act as a wake-up call. The FTSE 100 has closed down 15 points at 73.69. The pound buys $1.18 and €1.14. LBC weather: rain moving north, scattered showers for southern and western areas, lows of 3. Wednesday, some sunny spells and scattered showers. Windy and wet in the southwest later, highs of 12. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question with me, Iain Dale. On the show tonight, we have to my left Noah Hoffman, political reporter for The Sun. Richard Graham is Conservative MP for Gloucester. To my right, Yasmin Alibhai Brown, author and political commentator. And Steve Reid, Labour MP for Croydon North and Shadow Justice Secretary. So many issues that you can ask about tonight. 0345 6060 973. We've got the developing situation in Poland, where 2 Russian missiles have landed this afternoon, killing 2 people. We have Donald Trump making his announcement, I think at 2 a.m. UK time. I'm sure you'll all be staying up for that with Darren Adam. You may want to ask about that, but I don't want to lead you on the questions because you can ask about anything you like. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and of course you can use Alexa now. Just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and then just say your question. It's as simple as that. And don't forget to watch us if you'd like to on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Anthony in Staines. Hello, Anthony.
Hello, Iain and panel. And my question is, after what appears to be a Russian missile attack on Poland, with all cautions in place about that story at the moment, are we drawing ever closer to direct war with Russia?
Yasmin.
Yes, I fear so. I fear, I don't know what NATO can do. I've always felt, I felt for a long time, they should have come together and done a bit more. Words, I'm not a warmonger, I'm often a pacifist, but the situation is so dire at the moment, and Putin and his cronies think they can get away with it. So I fear we are edging towards, it's a bit like the First World War, edging towards a conflict that will become uncontainable.
It's really interesting you say that, because when I first heard about this, I immediately thought, well, it must be a mistake. There's no way that they would have deliberately done that. But then I thought, well, this is how the First World War started. It's the law of unintended consequences, isn't it? But, when you said you thought NATO could have done more, NATO has actually been a lot more unified on this than a lot of people would have thought on Ukraine.
On Ukraine, you can be unified and you can say what you say. But the big difference to remember with the Bosnian situation, Kosovan situation, was actually military action by NATO. And Bill Clinton, I think, was around then. And I don't think they can avoid. I hate wars. I've never supported a single war in my life, except the Second World War, which was a justified war. But I don't
Which
think...
we should say was before your time.
Are you sure about that? Do you know how old I am?
Richard Graham, I suspect you might find some common ground with Yasmin on this.
Well, it's a huge risk, isn't it? And I think everyone will do everything they possibly can to de-escalate and try and make sure that we avoid what we all hope is an accident escalating into something horrible. The risk is, as you've described it, but I think the opportunity is for NATO to demonstrate again its sort of coolness of response and to be measured and to make sure that those lines of communication are open with whomever on the Russian side to try and make sure that things don't get out of hand.
I mean, if this was deliberate, and let's not rule that out, it would be an odd time to do it, wouldn't it? With the G20 meeting, with all of the world's main leaders at the G20, you'd have thought, well, that wouldn't be the opportune time to sort of do this sort of thing.
Terrible timing, which is why I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt and very much hope that it is an accident.
Noah.
Yeah, I think a lot rests on whether or not it was intentional, and reporting right now suggests that that wasn't the case. And like everyone else on the panel, I really hope so. And I assume, but obviously we can't know it so early, that NATO will do what it can to avoid any major escalation that could come in the form of sort of increasing weapons supply to Ukraine, perhaps, rather than any sort of direct military action, because the last thing anyone wants to see is this horrible war getting worse. But I fully agree with Yasmin's remarks about it feeling like we are edging closer to war, and that would be absolutely tragic.
Knowing what we know about Vladimir Putin, do you think it's at all possible that he will admit, look, this was a terrible mistake, we'd like to apologise to the families of the two people that died, this wasn't intentional? Can you imagine him saying that in public? Because he would lose a lot of face, wouldn't he?
I can't imagine him saying that. No, I can't imagine him apologising.
There has to be consequences, doesn't there?
Well, like, he could say that it was a sort of rogue missile, but he won't apologise for it. I think that's far beyond his character, but maybe I'll be proven wrong.
Steve Reed.
Well, I mean, on the point itself, I think it's very important that we don't fill a vacuum of information with speculation. We don't know absolutely what's happened yet. I'm just looking at your screen in front of us, Iain, where the Russians are claiming to know nothing about where this missile originated from, so perhaps they will just deny it or claim somebody else did it. We don't know, but I don't think we should fill that lack of knowledge with our own speculation. Cool heads must prevail at times like this if we want to avoid a disaster. But what this does flag up to me is how our support and the West's united support for Ukraine is so important, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us. Because, as we've said all the way through this is not just an attack on Ukraine, it is an attack more widely. And if Putin, as the leader of an extremely authoritarian nuclear-armed state, is able to prevail in this case, who knows who's next? So I think we need to be looking at making sure we continue to give the Ukraine the support that they need. There was some speculation in the US elections that perhaps the Republicans may not be as committed. I hope that is not true. Perhaps the outcome in the Senate will mean that the support Ukraine needs will continue. I know across Europe, inside the EU and beyond, we feel the same. And I think that it's going to be important for us to look again at sanctions now. Are we doing enough? Do we need to cap the oil price? Do we need to target more oligarchs? There must be more we can do. I think they're having an effect. It's a slow effect, but it is having an effect, and I think we need to redouble our efforts to support Ukraine and ensure they win.
Are you surprised at the unity that NATO has displayed over the Ukraine conflict?
I'm not. This is an alliance of nations who are defending democracy and freedom, albeit we have some different ways of doing that, but we have principles behind this alliance. And for all the disputes that we may have amongst ourselves from time to time, when there is a real threat, as we see now from the kind of government that Vladimir Putin leads in Russia, then we're going to stand together and show him there is no chink of light for him in the wall that we'll put up against him.
Al says, I think that it's as dangerous not to act as to act. NATO should respond, but be measured in doing so. Now, those are fine words, actually, but I mean, what is a measured way of responding to something like this? Because, I mean, is it to say, OK, well, we are now going to supply the Ukrainians with the aircraft, with the ground cover that they've been asking for?
I think so. I don't think being cool and level-headed and being united is going to be enough. We have in this leader, and not just him, his defense minister is almost worse than Putin. And of course, what they're doing to the Ukraine since this little victory that Ukraine had this week, the punishment that is now being meted over. So at what point do we say we have to sort of show some muscle? Like I said, I hate saying this. It's not me, but I just fear what's
Gloria
happening.
here is accusing us of talking up war, saying, without all the facts, why are you talking up war like it's going to be a walk in the park? It's shocking. No one anywhere attempting to talk peace. Well, the problem is that what you're saying is we should ignore something that's a potentially very big story. Now, I think we all hope that it doesn't turn out to be a deliberate missile strike on Poland. I mean, I think the missiles landed on a grain plant, so they didn't land in the middle of nowhere. They actually landed on something that, for all I know, is quite strategically important. So I don't believe in censoring talk of this in the way that you suggest that we should. I don't think anyone is talking up war, even Yasmin.
Even I. But also a lot of my Polish friends who I've been talking to in the last hour or so are absolutely panicked. They're really panicking.
And I think we have to acknowledge that, don't we? Because, I mean, if we were in that situation and 2 Russian missiles landed on East Anglia or in the southeast or wherever, I think there would be very much cause for concern. But, of course, somebody else points out here that in 1999, the US actually accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy. Was that in Serbia?
It was.
Somewhere in the Balkans.
It was in Belgrade, wasn't it? That's quite right. So, I mean, I think all of the points, Ian, so far are valid ones. Cynthia's quite right. We shouldn't be talking up the possibility of war, let alone encouraging it. And, of course, the element that we haven't quite touched on is the Polish response, because this is effectively an issue for their national sovereignty as well. So the bilateral element, as well as the NATO response, is very important. Of course, all the leaders are there, or a lot of them, in Bali. So, as we touched on earlier, there is an opportunity for conversations to be had, reassurances to be given, but also real concern to be expressed by a wide variety of nations, wider than the usual sort of NATO, Europe and Russian discussion. So I think you're quite right to raise this, and I think that hopefully that listeners will agree that this rather difficult to define measured response, not rushing to conclusions, is the right one.
I think the problem here is that there were 2 missiles, not 1. And I'm not a military expert, but I don't know how difficult it is for 2 missiles to land in the same place, but people say they've misfired in some way. Jackson is in Dagenham and has got a related question. Hello, Jackson.
Hello. Because of this incident in Poland, is it reasonable now for NATO's response to provide Ukraine with long-range ATACMS missiles as a deterrent?
I'm not aware that Ukraine has asked for long-range missiles, because if you have long-range missiles, presumably the intention is for them to hit Russia.
Have, but we can provide it to them and tell the Russians that we are providing it to them as a deterrent.
That would be seen almost as a declaration of war, I suspect, Noah.
Yes, I suspect so. I just think it's very early to sort of rush to judgment about exactly what should be done, and I think the right people will be in the right rooms, the right advisors, people with knowledge about how to best move without making any unforced errors that could have massive consequences for us all. Unfortunately, I don't have that level of expertise, so I don't want to pass judgment. But I do have faith that the United Kingdom government has military advisors who have our best interests, who have Ukraine's best interests, because the two are interlinked. And there'll be lots of important discussions going on in NATO and within NATO countries and their defence committees about what to do.
I mean, Steve Reed, supplying extra tanks, supplying aircraft is a different ballgame to supplying long-range long-range weapons which could hit Russian cities. I mean, that I think would really be
that's key.
A big step.
It's key. I mean, what the West has been supplying to Ukraine is defensive capability, and that's critical, because if there were to be an attack on Russia from Ukraine, then we'd be in a whole other ballgame. I think everybody understands that. So I think missiles that enable that would not be welcome by anybody. The objective here is to get Russia out of Ukraine, back into Russia, and then we can move forward together. But for the time being, the starting point of this is, I think it's really important to reiterate this: we don't yet know what's happened, so we can't take decisions. We shouldn't be speculating about what might need to happen. We don't know.
I think cool heads is the phrase of the day, isn't it? Jonathan says Russia will say it was a false flag operation and deny all knowledge. Well, we've had no statement yet from the Russian government, so hopefully we might hear something on that relatively soon. As soon as we do, we'll bring it to you. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question on Cross Question. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
19 minutes past 8. We have with us on the panel Steve Reid, Labour MP for Croydon North and Shadow Justice Secretary. Richard Graham is Conservative MP for Gloucester. Yasmin Alibhai Brown, the author and political commentator, and Noah Hoffman, political reporter for The Sun. Let's go to a next question. It's a texter. Diane in Dudley says a 2-year-old boy has died in Greater Manchester as a result of mould in his council home. How can we sort out social housing? Now, LBC has done an investigation today into the number of homes that are unfit for human habitation in this country. You can find all the details on the LBC website. But it is quite astonishing that there's apparently 1.2 million homes, not because of necessarily mould, but other issues too. How in 2022 can this situation be allowed to happen? Obviously, this tragic case has highlighted it, Richard Graham, but you will have some of these homes in your constituency that either council, private landlords or housing associations are just not dealing with. How can that be allowed to happen?
Well, it's an incredibly important issue. We don't have any council housing now. It's all owned and run by housing associations. And yes, tenants do sometimes write in and complain that there are problems there which are not being addressed by the housing associations. What I think this particular incident in Rochdale stresses is that something like mould could be relatively minor, but in this case, it's caused the death of a young child. And so it's a reminder to all of us to take any complaints seriously. And I hope it's a wake-up call for housing associations and those councils who do still have stocks of housing to take complaints seriously and get onto them as quickly as possible.
And when you've had such letters from your constituents and you then presumably contact the housing association. Yeah. And I mean, how do they react to that? Because I always advise people to write to their MPs because there's nothing that an official likes less than a letter from a member of parliament, because it's sort of, they feel they do need to do something then. Do you normally get successful outcomes?
We quite often do. Rather than writing a letter, we'll speed it up, by email, and if we don't get a quick answer, we'll follow up by telephone. So I think a lot of the time we do get positive outcomes for precisely the reason that you've given, that chief execs don't like to be hassled by their local MP.
Because you go straight to the top, don't you?
You go straight to the top, because that's very effective, and they pass it down and action happens. But it's also true that we have got some quite old houses in Gloucester, and I suspect elsewhere in the country, and that's one of the reasons why regeneration schemes, levelling up funds, all the different tools that government can use to try and make sure we've got decent housing for our residents and those who are on the waiting lists, because there are lots of them.
But do you accept the fact that local authorities have had a 40% cut in their budgets over the last 12 years, and therefore they may well say, well, we can't be expected to do everything, and that is a legitimate argument that they can deploy?
Well, it would be for those local councils who still got housing stock and are running them themselves. And that's precisely why, in our case, I actually did a deal between the local council, Gloucester City Council, and the Treasury a decade ago to make sure that all the housing stock was passed to Gloucester City Homes, which was then an arm's length body, so that they can borrow against the asset of the housing stock and make sure they have got the finance in order to do the work necessary. I think if you've still got it in council ownership, then that can be difficult.
Steve Reid, your constituency, I suspect, is, shall we say, a little different to Richard's. Do you experience these problems a lot in Croydon?
A lot. And it's probably, this was it was a housing association property. It was in Oldham, as I understand it, Rochdale, actually. Rochdale. We see this in Croydon. I checked my caseload a few months ago. I had 30 outstanding disrepair cases in council and social housing at the time, and some of those we've been raising repeatedly, and we're not getting responses on behalf of the tenants who had contacted me. And of course only a minority of tenants would even think to contact their MP. So this just gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. And a few things that occur to me here. First of all is there has been a long-term lack of funding into social housing over the last decade or more, and what has happened over that time is that the the housing providers, whether it's a council or a housing association, have not carried out planned maintenance, and because of that, when they find they don't have the money to do the short-term repairs as well, the condition of the housing is getting worse. So we're seeing more damp, we're seeing more mould, we're seeing more leaks coming through, and that's
surely that should be at the top of any council's priority. I mean, housing is. I mean, councils are responsible for all sorts of things.
They are.
Whether it's sort of education, whether it's roads. But I mean, human habitation, I'd have thought, ought to come up there. They're the ones that decide what their priorities are.
I'm totally with you. I mean, I think there's two sides. It's partly it is funding, because the money hasn't been there to maintain these homes to the standard that they should be. And I think the decent home standard needs to be tightened and raised. But beyond that, there's some really poor management that goes on in the social housing sector as well. And I've seen this too. Really poorly managed contractors that get away with being paid without carrying out the repair work they're supposed to do. I've seen that, and I believe in this case there was something going on that I've seen in other councils as well, which is the council, the housing association, did not intervene to carry out the repairs because the tenant had gone to a solicitor, and while the case is live, they wouldn't carry out repairs. Now, in that circumstance, the situation continues, it gets worse, and it's ended up horrifically with the death of a little 2-year-old boy in one of the richest countries in the world. Completely avoided.
Have I imagined this? But were you leader of Croydon Council?
No, I was leader of Lambeth Council.
Lambeth Council. Well, it doesn't really matter which one it was. But you would have seen this from that point of view as well.
I saw it from that point of view. And one of the things that we did to try and, at that point we had a government, the Labour government then was investing in, they called the Decent Home Standard. So we got a lot of money to bring up to standard, lower standard homes, which I think is what needs to be done again. But beyond that, tenants didn't have a voice, was part of the problem. And I think in this case, that the tenant had been complaining to the housing association that had to go to a solicitor in the end. Nobody would listen to them. So one of the things we did was we allowed tenants on estates to elect their own management boards to whom the managers became accountable, and that really sharpened up their focus about what they needed to do, because the problems weren't just ricocheting up the management hierarchy in the town hall with performance indicators. The managers were accountable to the tenants, and if they weren't doing the job properly, the tenants would tell them and make sure that they focused on the job in hand. I think tenant voice is key.
When you think that 1 in 8 households living in social housing are living in conditions unfit for human habitation, I mean, Yasmin, you and I live in fairly leafy areas. It's a different world, isn't it?
It is
and because it's a different world, it gets ignored.
Yeah, but things have changed so much. My mother used to live in a housing association property, just half a mile from where I lived. It was so well kept, so well managed. Somehow, in the last decade or so, I think those tenants have society's lost the sense of obligation and duty to them, and they have been disrespected. I mean, never forget what happened at Grenfell. If you read what the lawyers said last week in their closing statements about how the tenants were just not listened to over and over again, how companies, the business side, Kensington Council, they just ignored them. And I also see that this poor family where the boy died, I think they were refugees.
Yeah, from Sudan.
And there's a whole set of attitudes. And Grenfell, 85% of those who died were of ethnic minority origins. So there's an added layer of disrespect and wanting to ignore these people. That has got to change.
Do you think it's people think, well, they can be ignored because they won't be able to make the fuss because they don't know the system that maybe other people do?
I think so. And it took courage for this father to do what he did. But his boy died.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's an unimaginable situation. And obviously, this is one case. It's a tragic case. But we know from the numbers that there are so many other properties out there where this could happen. It's not just a 2-year-old that can suffer from a respiratory condition. Older people, in particular, suffer from respiratory conditions. And I suspect there are many cases like this that we never hear about.
Yes. And also on this issue of respiratory conditions, obviously that is terrible and a massive reason why council properties, housing associations should never be able to get into this situation. But even beyond that, why should anyone have to live with the unsightliness of mould? You know, we're not animals. It's gross. If I see the tiniest bit of mould in my flat, I feel uncomfortable. I want to get rid of it straight away. And why should I have that ability to, get rid of the mold and not someone living in social housing. I think it's appalling. I think obviously for health reasons it should never be able to happen. But even beyond that, I don't think anyone deserves to live in a mold infested property. It's disgusting and it needs immediate attention. And I assume and I hope with this case it will. I know Michael Gove had some words today on it and spoke about bringing forward legislation that would see housing associations held much more accountable. But you just look at some photos on social media. There's their housing campaigner, Quajo, I've forgotten his last name, apologies. And I watch his videos and that should not be allowed to happen, ever.
And he's apparently a great fan of Michael Gove and sees him as somebody who can bring in the kind of reforms that are needed. And I think that there is a piece of legislation about to go through Parliament now. But what about public responsibility here? Because, I mean, this is a form, and I hate using this expression, but it is a form of involuntary manslaughter, isn't it? And should there not be consequences for public bodies or even private bodies that don't take the requisite actions that are clearly needed that then result in the death of somebody? If that was in the private sector, I suspect that there would be a case. Should public sector bodies be immune from this sove of action?
So I'm not sure what the legal situation is, but I think they should absolutely be held accountable. And as I said, Michael Gove did promise this legislation to make that happen, and I believe that he does want to see that happen. I think they should, yes, without question, be held responsible.
Did you want to come in, Steve?
Well, I just, the private sector, I was huffing, so it's just so awful that this could have happened to a kid of two. But, the private sector, this would be corporate manslaughter legislation exists. And that, we've talked about at Labour Party conference this year bringing in Hillsborough law, which is to give the victims of state failure support to take out legal cases against the entities of the state or organisations.
But the problem is, I suppose, that if you bring in too restrictive laws, that maybe affects their director of housing in a local authority where they have ultimate responsibility. Who on earth would want to be a director of housing on not necessarily a very high salary with that kind of sort of responsibility? You might find it quite difficult to get people to do the job.
I don't think so. I think you want good people to get those jobs. Grenfell, going back to Grenfell, no, there will be criminal prosecutions in that case, but they can't do anything until the final report is published, which could be 2023, 2024. I mean, these poor people who've been waiting for justice, they're prepared, or lawyers are really preparing for them. I think this could be a test case, just like Hillsborough was.
I think there is a thing that could happen immediately, though, which is that if a tenant takes legal action, then the council, the housing provider, should not stop carrying out the repairs while the legal case is underway. That's what happened here. And legal cases can go on for years. And in this case, that poor little child has died. And I think that is a very quick change. Of course, it's much bigger than that, but there's something that could come out of this straight.
Right, we'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. But first, let's get the LBC News headlines at 8:32 with Charlotte Morgan.
Poland's government has started emergency security meetings after reports 2 Russian missiles landed on a farm near the Ukrainian border, killing 2 people. There are unconfirmed reports that they strayed from their Ukrainian targets. President Biden has pledged to defend every inch of NATO alliance territory. Analysis by LBC has revealed more than 1 million people in England, that's more than 1 in 8 households, are living in unsafe social homes. It says a coroner says the death of 2-year-old Awab Ishak from damp must act as a wake-up call. The government's described it as a tragedy and says it's bringing forward legislation to hold housing associations to account. And England's footballers have landed in Qatar ready for the World Cup. The Wales squad is also due. LBC weather, rain moving northwards overnight for southern and western areas, lows of 3. Tomorrow, some sunny spells and scattered showers. Windy and wet in the southwest later, highs of 12.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Some breaking news from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Their official Twitter account has said this in reaction to these two rockets landing in Poland. Polish mass media and officials commit deliberate provocation to escalate situation with their statement on alleged impact of, in inverted commas, Russian rockets at, and the village's name I can't pronounce, Przewodów, something like that. Russian hardware has launched no strikes at the area. Well, of course, that sentence can be taken in many ways. They might not have launched strikes at the area. The strikes may have been meant for Lviv, which is about 100 kilometres away, and gone off target. So I'm not sure that takes us any further, really. Right, let me reintroduce my panel, because I know a lot of you tune in around this time. Steve Reid is Labour MP for Croydon North and Shadow Justice Secretary. Richard Graham is Conservative MP for Gloucester. Yasmin Alibhai Brown is an author and political commentator. And Noah Hoffman is political reporter for The Sun. Right, let's go to another question. It's an Alexa question from Linda in Glasgow. The COVID Bereaved Families campaign group flew a banner over the jungle in protest at Matt Hancock's appearance on I'm a Celeb. But is he winning you over yet? We were talking about this in the break. Noah, you don't even watch it, so I don't know whether I'm going to come to you.
Well, I just want to put on the record that I am boycotting. I'm doing my own personal boycott of the show, because I think it's appalling that he has abandoned...
Unlike your newspaper.
No, I don't think our newspaper supports MPs.
No, but you're covering it.
Oh, yeah, of course we're covering it. The whole world is covering it. But personally, I'm not watching it, because I don't think his ego needs any more inflating whatsoever. I just think this is a massive PR stunt, and it's coming at the detriment of his constituents, who deserve to have a voice in Parliament and have effectively been abandoned.
Richard Graham, as a Tory MP, are you jealous of Matt Hancock? Wouldn't you like to be eating a kangaroo's penis at this very moment?
No, I can genuinely promise you, Ian, that I have no envy and no desire to go and eat any of those exciting things. I thought you said during the interval that this was going to be a programme where there wasn't going to be a Matt Hancock question.
Well, that wasn't at that point, but my producers have decided that obviously we needed one.
But I'm going to disappoint you, because I'm afraid I've never watched this programme. I haven't seen Matt ever. But my taxi driver said to me the other day, he asked me about it, guy in Gloucester, and I said to him, what do you think? And he said, my wife is worried that I'm going to end up liking him.
Well, you see,
and
that's
that may be the way it's going to go.
Having watched every episode so far, I think that's the way it is going, in that he's won round all of the other campmates who really were quite appalled at him actually being with them in the jungle, and he's done all of these tasks. He hasn't flinched at all. He's won them all these meals, and they now quite admire him. Steve, have you been watching?
I haven't actually, no. And but I have. It was Remembrance Day on Sunday, so I was up in Crystal Palace at the War Memorial, and there were a lot of people there. And tragically, the issue of Matt Hancock does come up a lot at the moment, because they see an MP and they know that there's an MP doing that. People on the whole don't like it, I don't think, and people are watching it. There's something fascinating and compelling about watching it. But there's a general sense that people have said to me is that we vote for MPs to go to Parliament to represent us. There's a major crisis going on in our country, a cost of living crisis. There's war in Europe for the first time since the Second World War. And here's Matt Hancock swanning off to the jungle in this massive publicity stunt that I understand he's getting £400,000 for doing, but he's still taking his MP's salary as well. And he's taking the piss, isn't he, of the people who sent him to Parliament.
I knew you were going there, to which I have to apologise.
I'm sorry.
It's before 9 o'clock.
I do
sorry if anyone was offended by that.
Yeah,
Yasmin, you're not such a potty mouth, are you?
I'm not. Well, let me tell you, the question raised, the person who got in touch talked about the COVID families, and that's what we should also be talking about. Of course, he's failing as an MP. He's failed his ex-wife and children who will be watching, and to find redemption in this horrible way and get paid for it. I haven't watched it. I will not watch this man. I despise him more than my words allow me to say. But the COVID people must be especially wounded by this, because of so much that happened during that early period. They do believe a lot of it was Matt Hancock's carelessness, if nothing else. And so I don't know what the programme makers think they're doing to bring him on as an entertaining factor when there's still so much pain around the whole COVID period. It's disgraceful.
Shall we move on, given that none of you have watched it, and I now feel guilty because I have watched every episode. I'm so shallow, which will come as no surprise to anybody. Claire is in Edgware. Claire, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. George Eustace admitted in Parliament that the Australia deal would be very damaging to our farmers, and everyone agrees it will not contribute much, if anything, to our economy and entirely benefits Australia. Can we legally get out of this disastrous post-Brexit deal?
Claire using some hyperbole there, but it clearly, from what George Eustace was saying, and let's remember he was DEFRA Secretary at the time, so he ought to know, but most of it was negotiated by Liz Truss when she was International Trade Secretary. The feeling is the government was so desperate to do a new trade deal with Australia that it gave away the kitchen sink.
I mean, my take on it, Ian, for what it's worth, is that I think there was huge pressure, and some of that was designed by Liz Truss herself, to try and get those two FTAs over the line as quickly as possible, a demonstration of what could be achieved from our newly found Brexit freedoms and so on. And I think there was always a team in DEFRA, which includes one of my former researchers, who felt that there were things that could be done that would help us, for example, sell more Jaguars, possibly more financial services and other manufactured products to Australia, but that it might come at the cost of some of our animal welfare standards and importing cheaper Australian produce at the cost of some of our own high-quality farming produce. So that was always going to be the challenge and the balance of those FTAs, and it's a moot point about which side you come down on. George, obviously, as a farmer himself and responsible for DEFRA, clearly didn't like that. He lost out at the time, if you like, and now he's getting his own back. And
well, he's gone further today. He's told the Newsagents podcast with Emily Maitlis and John Sopel and Lewis Goodall that Liz Truss undermined the British national interest by signing this deal. That is quite an accusation to make against somebody who, until recently, of course, was Prime Minister.
It's quite a strong statement, and I mean, I think the only observation I would make is that it looks as if Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is going to take the TPP negotiations slightly more slowly, not so many defined deadlines, which gives more time to focus on the quality and the end result rather than trying to rush the thing through. And that may be a reflection on what he's seen from these two FTAs.
But what about the question from Claire, should we try and get out of it?
I think once you've signed a free trade agreement, it's an extremely hard thing to reverse out of. And you'd need to have a mutual agreement to sit down and try and improve the FTA. There might be various objectives the Australians, for example, in this case have, and various ones that we have. But I think it's a bit soon for all that.
Steve Reid.
Well, I mean, first of all, George Eustace was the Agriculture Secretary when this went through. I've seen clips of him in the House of Commons praising this deal when it went through, and now he's attacking it. I wish ministers would just be honest at the time. If he knew this was going on,
he would have had to resign, wouldn't
well, he should have resigned. If he genuinely thought Liz Truss was damaging the national interest, which is what he tells us, why did he stay in post and go along with it? That's a pretense. He was deceiving the public, wasn't he, in what he was doing? Now, as it happens, he's right in what he's saying. But when he was a minister, he could have done something to stop this. And it was quite clear that what Liz Truss was trying to do was get a feather in her cap in her long-term plan to become leader of the Conservative Party. And if that meant doing a damaging deal and pretending it was a good deal, well, then she was prepared to do that, and that's tragic that other Tory ministers went along with that. Now, the situation underneath this is we've lost an awful lot of our trade with our European neighbours because of the withdrawal agreement. You know, we've effectively put up trade barriers between ourselves and Europe. Europe's on our doorstep. The Pacific is the other side of the planet. You might have read about the cheesemaker that went bust. I saw that in the papers over the weekend because he'd lost £600,000 worth of his trade with Europe and couldn't sell his goods there anymore. Hospitality industry in my constituency across the country, they've lost all the workers, and a lot of places are closing down because of that now. Food rotting in the fields. We can't get the agricultural workers. We have to make Brexit work. The country voted for that. Personally, I didn't, but the country voted for that. We respect that as a democratic decision, but it doesn't mean big trade barriers that stop trade with Europe, and it doesn't mean a refusal to bring in the people to do the work that our country needs now while we train up our own people to take those jobs in future. The government's got this wrong.
I'm going to ask Noah and Yasmin to restrict themselves to quite short answers on this. So if you want a longer answer, we'll do it after the break.
3 words.
3 words, go on.
Brexit isn't working.
That's 4. No.
No.
Well, obviously, I would.
Is not.
Isn't. I said isn't.
I would very respectfully disagree with Yasmin, but I agree with Steve's specific point about George not coming out at the time. If he thought that this was going to be as damaging as he has made out on the Newsagents podcast and in the Commons chamber, why didn't he do what some would say is the honourable thing and make a show of it and resign?
I mean, what I can't get round sort of my head is thinking that a cabinet minister would negotiate an agreement with another country that they knew was, I mean, okay, any free trade agreement, you're going to have to weigh up different aspects of it, and there will always be bits that benefit one country and not another. But if George Eustace is right, I mean, this is an absolute
it's party before country, isn't it? Again.
Well, it's not even party before country; it's self before country.
Even worse. Yep.
Yeah. On that bombshell, it's 8:47.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
They're just lovely
8
people.
minutes to 9 on LBC. We have Steve Reed, Richard Graham, Yasmin Alibhai Brown and Noah Hoffman with me taking your calls and questions. Right, here's an Alexa question from Amy in Leicester. Dominic Raab will be filling in for the Prime Minister tomorrow in the Commons at PMQs. What should Keir Starmer ask him first? Well, Keir Starmer, I don't think, Noah, will be asking the questions, will he? It'll be Angela Rayner, I would have thought.
Yes, and it will definitely
So
be...
goody.
Everyone's rubbing their hands together. It will be one to watch because Angela Rayner has a great, very sort of alluring personality. She's great at the dispatch box. She's so confident in who she is, and then that really comes across when she fires away questions. Dominic Raab isn't bad at answering them either. He does tend to be at the dispatch box very, very well prepped, and manages to sort of tone things down and respond quite well. So I think it's going to be a showstopper. The focus will, of course, be on Dominic Raab and allegations about bullying and about his conduct towards civil servants. And I think we can expect Angela Rayner to not hold back when she grills him.
It's quite a difficult one, though, isn't it? Because with all the crises that are going on in the world, we've been talking about them this evening, might it be seen as a bit gratuitous to go on that as the first question?
Possibly, and I do think that it should not take up the entirety of her time because, as you say, there are very important issues. But I don't think bullying should be dismissed. It's a very serious issue, even if it's not deemed by sort of the Cabinet Office as a resignable offence. It doesn't mean that it's not something that should be, that's not within the public interest to know, and that shouldn't be probed. So I think it's very fair for Angela Rayner to ask him about it, and let's see what his response is, because so far his spokesperson and his team have denied the allegations, and they should have every right to defend themselves.
Steve Reed, will you be sort of taking your place beside Angela Rayner, getting in the picture there?
Well, it's going to be an interesting... PMQs, to be honest, the Prime Minister's questions, it's a bit of a pantomime, to be honest. I know it's enjoyable, a bit compelling, a bit like watching Hancock in the jungle. But the issues behind this are very important, actually. As Noah was saying, bullying is not a laughing matter. It is important that we maintain high standards in public life. It's very important if you want government to work effectively. And what we've heard about Dominic Raab so far from senior civil servants in the departments where he's been, and it's been a whole range of them now, is that he created a culture of fear, that there was bullying, there was intimidation, his officials felt demeaned, there was a formal expression of concern sent by the Perm Sec, I think the chief civil servant in the Brexit department when he was there, to the cabinet secretary. That's a complaint by any other words. And Rishi Sunak says there hasn't been a formal complaint. Well, there has been. I think it's important that there's an investigation set up into what's been going on here. But it's not just Raab, because we've had the Williamson fiasco, we've had the Braverman debacle. There are issues about Grant Shapps when he assumed an alias and was...
Well, there are issues along these lines in all political parties. I agree with you, it's not just one party, but what we've had in the past is an ethics advisor. Now, the last one, Lord Geidt, resigned under Boris Johnson, and Johnson never replaced him. Liz Truss never replaced him. Rishi Sunak said the first thing he'd do when he came in would be to replace him. There's still no ethics advisor. Maybe no one wants the job.
Well, I don't think...
You'd be working overtime the whole time, wouldn't you?
You'd certainly be kept very busy.
May I speak?
Yes. You never normally ask.
I'm so intimidated by it. No, I don't think it's helpful to say all the parties are at it. There has been a singular culture developed over the last many years. Remember the cases that were taken out against Priti Patel and then seen away through... They were paid off, virtually, the civil servants who were going to take... I wish they hadn't accepted the money and actually done something about it. That would have changed the culture so well, as has been said. And I think there is a terrible atmosphere, not in all departments. Some ministers are good and kind and kind of decent. But in too many departments, this arrogance of being in power for too long and throwing your weight around is not good for the nation to actually put up with that.
I mean, I hesitate to mention Gordon Brown throwing mobile phones.
Well, that doesn't mean it's right.
No, I'm not saying that it's right.
The level of this.
I mean, Richard Graham, do you think
there's a whole list.
Do you think there is a pattern here, as Yasmin is suggesting? Because there are quite a few cases, aren't there?
I think politicians come in all shades and stripes. There are those like David Cameron, who it's very hard to imagine any accusations of bullying at all. There are others, secretaries of state like Greg Clark, who are incredibly polite and courteous. Michael Gove is famed for his courtesy. And there are others whose fuses may be shorter, and that's on all sides of the political spectrum. So I don't think we should be aiming for a sort of perfect model of behaviour in every politician, because I don't think human nature is like that. But clearly when people overstep the mark, then they need to be accountable and brought to account. And if there are legal issues over an individual's perceived bullying, then those have got to be tackled. Whether PMQ is the right place to tackle them is a moot point.
Well, we'll find out tomorrow. Right, quick text from Natasha in Plymouth. Donald Trump is expected to announce later that he's going to run for president again. Can he win? 30 seconds each. Steve?
No. Yeah, I don't think it can. I mean, what we've seen, that was trying to be really brief. I think he'll announce, but I'm not sure he can win, because if you look at the results in the US, the Republicans underperformed, and the ones who underperformed the most were the ones that he'd endorsed and that believed in his conspiracy theories.
Yes,
so
Murdoch says no.
He does, doesn't he? Which is interesting.
And so even if he does
Murdoch doesn't back losers, does he?
No, I wish Murdoch didn't have that much power, but he has announced he won't be backing Trump.
And you clearly aren't either.
No.
I mean, it would be a news headline if you were.
I would never back such a man.
Noah?
I hope he doesn't announce, but I think that's wasted hope. And I equally hope that he couldn't. I don't think he could win. I think people have seen his sort of psychopathic behaviour and had enough of it. No.
Richard?
It's been a great week for democracy, I think, actually. I think what the American people have shown us is that they've been able to defy expectations. They've effectively rejected Trump and a lot of what he stands for. And I think there's an opportunity for the Republicans to find someone else and get their act together in a way that's much more acceptable to the voters. Then we've got a real challenge.
So give us an election here.
Oh, don't start that one. I asked for brief answers.
On that note.
Good note to end.
Right, final fun text from Jason in Bromsgrove. You like this one, Noah. The maker of Moet et Chandon and Veuve Clicquot says it's running out of stock on our best champagnes because rich people are buying so much of it. If you had endless money, which one drink, alcoholic or not, would you buy up en masse?
I'm going to sound really basic. I would buy Prosecco.
That's very basic. Richard?
I would probably go for a good case of Gloucester Gold from my favourite brewery.
Ever the politician. Steve, are there any breweries in Croydon?
No. Well, I've been at a number of pubs in central London recently, and you can't get a decent pint of bitter anymore. Sometimes when you say I'd like a pint of bitter, the bar staff don't even know what you mean. So I would buy some keg bitter, I think, yeah.
Yasmin?
I'd never spend that amount of money on booze.
Well, you can be non-alcoholic. Any drink.
Even that. I'm a very cautious
person. I would buy up all supplies of Lilt, which is my tipple of choice.
What
is Lilt? What is Lilt?
What is Lilt?
Honestly,
you don't watch I'm a Celebrity. You don't know what Lilt is. You're out of touch with popular culture, Richard. Your team need to educate you.
I'm going to back Richard here. I don't know what it is either.
It's yellow and sweet.
It's pineapple.
Well, this side of the table knows.
Fizzy drink. It's lovely. I mean, it used to be really famous. There was adverts, sort of Lilt with a totally tropical taste. I won't do the accent because I'll probably get sacked if I do.
It's had a good plug this evening.
On that note, I think it needs a bit more advertising, clearly. On that note, Steve Reed, Richard Graham, Yasmin Alibhai Brown and Noah Hoffman, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we're going to talk about private health because the Prime Minister refuses to say whether he uses private health. I don't know why he's being so coy. Why should anyone be ashamed of using private healthcare? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Russian Ministry of Defence has denied involvement in the launch of missiles on the territory of Poland, saying it's a deliberate provocation with the aim of escalating the situation. It claims Russian weapons were not used to strike targets near the Ukrainian-Polish state border. Poland's government has started emergency security meetings after reports that 2 missiles landed on a farm there, killing 2 people. Here's our Washington correspondent Simon Marks.
President Biden has consistently drawn